Yes, the answer to the video's title is yes. Through a combination of covert action through the CIA and economic pressure placed on the Chilean government, the United States helped bring about a coup that would remove President Salvador Allende from power and replace it with a military dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet on September 11th, 1973. Don't worry, I wasn't going to string that out for half an hour. The CIA, though, aren't so sure that they were behind the coup. In a 2014 article for Foreign Affairs, former acting director of CIA operations Jack Devine wrote, quote, "I can say with conviction that the CIA did not plot with the Chilean military to overthrow Allende in 1973. Apparently, the first time Devine heard about the coup was 2 days before its execution, whilst he was eating at an Italian restaurant in Santiago. Now, sure, that isn't exactly surprising. It's not like the United States would admit to overthrowing the government of Chile in a coup. Except they do. The CIA does acknowledge that they conspired directly with the military to overthrow the Allende government, but in 1970, not 1973. The CIA openly admits to organizing a failed coup against Allende, but vehemently denies that it organized the successful one. Now, this doesn't seem to make much sense. Does the United States just want people to think that they're bad at overthrowing governments? Well, the actual explanation is actually pretty simple. The CIA are probably telling the truth. The CIA probably weren't directly involved in the overthrow of Allende in 1973. Here's what most people get wrong about the 1973 coup. Until 1973, Chile was generally considered the most democratic country in Latin America. However, whilst many historians consider modern Chilean democracy as beginning with the downfall of the liberal September junta in 1925, the early republic was beset by instability and authoritarianism. With an economy heavily dependent on the export of copper, Chile was hit especially hard by the collapse of the global economy in 1929. It's in this backdrop of economic crisis that communist and socialist factions of the military would attempt a series of coups in the early 1930s, culminating in the establishment of the 1932 junta, which briefly proclaimed the creation of a socialist military regime before its collapse later that year. With this brief flirtation with Marxism, when the Red Scare hit Chile, it hit Chile hard. In 1948, President Gabriel González Videla, a progressive with ties to organized labor who had previously entered into coalition with the communists, enacted the ironically named Law for the Permanent Defense of Democracy, which banned the Communist Party. González's actions came in the backdrop of the Czechoslovak coup, in which a moderate leftist-led government which had cooperated with the Communist Party saw its communist coalition partners subvert democratic institutions from within and establish a Soviet-aligned dictatorship. In González's mind, the parallels were terrifying. A series of strikes that paralyzed the country in 1947 led the president to increasingly believe that there was a Soviet-led conspiracy to establish a communist regime in Chile. In the backdrop of the strikes, González told crowds that, quote, "the Chilean worker is deceived and is serving a foreign power." From this moment, opposition to communism stopped being just ideological, but national. Increasingly, communism became a foreign ideology. Those who supported it weren't just extremists, but as González put it, traitors to the fatherland. Many in Chile's military, which by this time was considered the most apolitical in Latin America, began to believe that defending Chile against communism was an extension of their role as the nation's protectors. A certain army captain bought into this ideology particularly strongly. Captain Augusto Pinochet had been placed in charge of Pisagua, an internment camp for those leftists González considered to be a threat to democracy. Was there any truth to the paranoia? Well, there was some. Declassified Soviet intelligence documents show that the Soviets were certainly happy with the growth of the Chilean left. However, formal KGB contacts would not be established until 1961. If any country was interfering in Chile's politics at this point, it was America. As the threat of the Soviet-sympathizing Salvador Allende actually winning power began to grow in the 1950s and 60s, America started funneling millions of dollars through the CIA to support its favorite candidates with propaganda, campaign materials, and sometimes outright bribes. This came with above-board politics as well, namely economic support and increased diplomatic relations. To show America's support for Latin America against the USSR, in 1958 Eisenhower sent his vice president, a certain Richard Nixon, to tour South America. His visit was somewhat disrupted in Chile's northern neighbour of Peru, where university students protested his arrival, with many chanting, "Go home, Nixon!" Nixon handled this situation with his characteristic diplomacy, by which I mean he repeatedly yelled that the crowd were cowards. Somehow unconvinced by this argument, students started throwing rocks. After fleeing back to his hotel, one local spat tobacco in the vice president's face, to which Nixon responded by kicking the gentleman in the shins. He would later publicly claim that those protesters were part of, in his words, the international communist conspiracy. History rarely gives such good metaphors as it did for Nixon's future policy towards Latin America. After Nixon lost his first run for president in 1960, the newly elected JFK announced the so-called Alliance for Progress, in which Chile would play the leading role. More than just providing support for an increasingly corrupt anti-communist establishment, the Alliance for Progress would provide aid and other economic assistance to speed up Latin America's development. Of course, they would still do the first thing as well. Elected in 1964, Eduardo Frei Montalva promised a revolution of liberty to Chile. This revolution would consist of dramatic reforms to fix the country's inequality, build economic independence from the USA, and improve growth. The liberty it referred to was the overall preservation of the capitalist system, with some partial nationalization, particularly in Chile's lucrative copper industry. His platform achieved not only success with the working class, a traditional base of Allende, but with anti-communists, to whom he sold his program as the only way to prevent the rise of communism. It was also popular with America's left-leaning but fiercely anti-communist Johnson administration, which covertly supplied Frei with $3 million, roughly $30 million in today's money. Once Frei's election had been bought, America flooded the country with investment, hoping to build in Chile a model of Latin American development that would renew the continent's belief in the capitalist system. Whilst this achieved material results, Chileans watched in dismay as the country began to become further reliant on America. Even these improvements in the quality of life began to stagnate in 1968, as the Republicans took charge in the United States. The new administration believed that the Alliance for Progress was just another way that the Third World was taking advantage of American generosity. As Frei's results began to waver and the gulf between American and Chilean power became more apparent, disillusioned Chileans began to believe that even the most radical solutions within a capitalist system would be unable to solve Chile's problems. Beginning with an unprecedented mandate, Frei's popularity slowly plateaued over his 6 years in power. By the time Frei's term expired in 1970, a new man was in the White House, one who was still slightly annoyed about being spat on all those years ago. Under Nixon, the CIA spent more on 1970 than any previous election, massively dwarfing KGB covert support for Allende. It didn't matter. Most Chileans considered Frei's revolution to be a failure. Allende won a plurality of the vote, becoming Chile's first socialist leader since the 1932 coup and the first democratically elected socialist in the history of South America. The ferry investments designed to stop Allende coming to power suddenly became a liability. American companies began putting pressure on the Nixon administration, but they hardly needed to. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger summed up the mood of the White House well when he said, quote, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people. The issues are much too important for the Chilean voter to be left to decide for themselves."
El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
Two tracks were proposed to remove Allende from power. The first track involved a method that was technically constitutional if you squinted your eyes hard enough and really believed. The 1925 constitution required a candidate to receive an absolute majority of the popular vote. If no candidate received a majority, then the National Congress would decide the winner, with Allende only winning a plurality of 36.61% to Jorge Rodriguez's 35.27%. The American government hopes that the narrowness of Allende's victory could be used to convince Congress to refuse to elect him as president. Although the opposition held an overwhelming majority in both chambers, it was convention to vote for the candidate who had received the largest share of the popular vote. The idea of voting for someone who hadn't won the largest share of the popular vote was contemplated by Frey during the 1964 election, who had feared that Allende might beat him to the presidency. The American embassy had also supported the idea, with it advising the Johnson administration to expand support for the Chilean military and police forces to deal with the unrest that would inevitably follow. The CIA quickly realized that Congress would not deny Allende a victory in 1970. As much as Congress hated Allende, they respected democracy more. That's where Track 2 came in. The military would do what Congress would not. According to Nixon's CIA director, Richard Helms, the agency was opposed to the coup plan, not on moral terms but practical ones. Unlike President Nixon, they appreciated that a military which took such pride in defending democracy would not overthrow a democratically elected government. Despite his better judgment, Helms was ordered to carry out a coup regardless. Hastily made minutes by Helms read, 1 in 10 chance, perhaps, but save Chile. Unfortunately for Chile, it would have to wait another 3 long years to be saved. As the first stage of the coup, the CIA organized the kidnapping of Army Commander-in-Chief René Schneider, a constitutionalist who opposed military intervention against the government. His subsequent murder, something that the CIA maintained was unintended, led to uproar among the military. He was swiftly replaced by Carlos Prats, another constitutionalist. The murder of such a respected military figure delegitimized military interventionism among even its former supporters in the military. Nixon was dejected. According to Devine, this is where the story ends. At that point, all coup plotting ended and Nixon drastically altered his policy. Now, in some sense, this is true. Diplomatic cables, CIA memorandums, and White House minutes declassified under the Clinton administration show that efforts to directly instigate a coup would not occur after 1970. In fact, as late as 1972, the CIA was still skeptical of a coup actually being possible. The CIA had failed to save Chile in 1970, but another scribble made by Helms on the minutes described an approach that would achieve results. Make the economy scream. For the first year, things looked pretty good for Allende. After 1970, the CIA would never attempt to directly plan a coup again. But Washington's strategy to create what it called a coup climate would continue. Allende's reforms seemed to work even better than Frey's had initially. With the government's full nationalization of the copper industry, Chilean GDP was massively boosted in 1971, increasing by 8.6%, an unprecedented growth level in Chilean history. In the same time period, inflation fell by almost a third. But there was a problem. Allende had forgotten who it was that bought Chilean copper. America and its allies made up 86.1% of Chilean copper exports. America alone provided 38.5% of Chilean imports, although not all of America's allies would follow Washington's lead on economic pressure. A number, including the UK, would. Try as they might, the Soviets could not make up for the shortfall. In 1972, Chilean inflation was at 200%. Economic pressure came in combination with millions pumped into propaganda. Black propaganda, which alleged to show Allende's plans for a Czechoslovak-style coup, a long-standing fear of Chilean anti-communists, boosted tensions in the country even further. Fears weren't cooled by the increasingly noticeable Cuban military presence in the country. In the same way the collapse of global demand in 1929 caused the creation of a socialist military junta in Chile, this artificial economic crisis would bring an end to Chilean socialism and cause the creation of a capitalist junta. As the economic situation began to worsen, protests against shortages spread across the country. Jack Devine describes the CIA's involvement as playing, quote, an important role in the growth of protests in Chile. But he still argues that it emerged fundamentally from genuine discontent against the government. In one protest, protesters threw chicken feed at soldiers, implying that they were too chicken to overthrow the government. American strategy hoped that Allende would clamp down on protests, delegitimizing himself as an authoritarian and confirming the worst suspicions of the army. Aware of American-backed attempts to involve the military in politics, the USSR extended a cheap loan to Chile to purchase Soviet equipment for military modernization. However, what was effectively a bribe to the military backfired. It did little to assuage the increasingly common belief among the armed forces that the USSR was actively intervening in the nation's politics. On the 29th of June 1973, the Rubicon was crossed. A tank battalion surrounded government buildings in the capital and demanded the president step down and give way to a transitional government. The still respected Commander-in-Chief, Carlos Prats, retained loyalty from the military and quickly quashed the rebels. However, Carlos was too noble for his own good. Feeling they had betrayed democracy and failing to stop such a coup from happening in the first place, Carlos, along with 3 other leading constitutionalists, resigned. Their replacements, that included a certain Mr. Pinochet, were less keen on constitutionalism. A harsh crackdown on yet another protest against shortages would be the final straw. Frey, who is now serving as the president of the Senate, passed a resolution through Congress calling for Allende to step down. 3 weeks later, British-built Hunter jets were bombing the presidential palace. After Allende's body was carried out, Pinochet declared a new junta. Frey praised Pinochet for saving democracy and ending Allende's totalitarian project. On the 1st of October, Pinochet told Time magazine that, quote, democracy has to be bathed occasionally in blood so that it can continue to be democracy. A month before his interview, Pinochet had reopened the Pisagua camp in which he had spent the formative years of his military career. Tens of thousands would be detained without trial here and in other camps across the country. But it was, of course, worth it for the democracy that Pinochet so valued. Congress was dissolved 2 days after the coup to prevent another leftist threat to democracy from ever rising again. Documents declassified last year showed that the CIA were aware of Pinochet's coup plan significantly earlier than Jack Devine's revelation in an Italian restaurant. America made preparations for the coup, and once the coup had been achieved, immediately recognized the new junta. Was the United States covertly involved directly in the 1973 coup in Chile? The committee can find no evidence that it was. These were the words of the Church Committee, a congressional committee set up in 1975 to look at the potential of US involvement in the 1973 coup. Looking at that, you'd conclude that the United States was not behind the coup in Chile. That's certainly the interpretation that Jack Devine has of the report.
Place. And I found it abhorrent that Congress would be reviewing it in the public domain. But what's interesting is the years go by, and in the process of writing the book, I went back and reread the Church report. It's actually a very good report. And I think they did a good job describing. I was having trouble about having secrets in the public. what you see is that the Church Commission and what's in the declassified documents is that there was a bad attempt at the direction of the White House, despite the local chiefs' disagreement. It was a failure. But what people don't realize is right after that, the White House sent a cable saying, try and support the opposition media, the opposition political parties, any interest group that's opposing Allende, stop it from turning communist, but do not plot with the military.
Now, of course, we've seen that it's true that the United States did not directly conspire with the Chilean military to instigate the 1973 coup. However, Devine interestingly didn't seem to read the line immediately after that one. However, the United States sought in 1970 to foment a military coup in Chile. After 1970, it adopted a policy both overt and covert of opposition to Allende, and it remained in intelligence contact with the Chilean military, including officers who were participating in coup plotting. The report concludes that it was an American policy objective to achieve a coup in Chile even after the miscalculation of military opinion in 1970. This is what people get wrong about Chile. America did not plan the coup. It had to influence actors on the ground to behave in its interests. This is also what people get wrong about American foreign policy more broadly. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. In Iran, just like in Chile, the CIA and MI6 failed to overthrow the democratically elected Mossadegh government in 1953. However, the failed coup, in conjunction with American economic pressure, destabilized the Mossadegh government to the point of enabling an organic coup to develop against Mossadegh. Like Chile, the CIA takes credit for the failed coup and denies the successful one. Also like Chile, sympathetic historians have tried to portray the fact that the US coup failed as evidence that the US wasn't responsible for the overthrow of the Mossadegh government. In both cases, America only had the ability to guide actors to carry out actions that it wanted carried out. As historian Sebastian Hurtado Torres puts it, the hegemonic power of the United States could influence Chilean politics not because of its unilateral intent, but because the main actors of the institutional system of Chilean politics sought to take advantage of that hegemonic power and direct it towards their own purposes. Like all good history videos, I made this video to correct people. Not just the people who think that the CIA weren't involved in the overthrow of the Allende government, but the people that know that it was. Although I think I've successfully destroyed Jack Devine's arguments with facts and logic, they're premised on a very common misconception about the coup in Chile and American interventionism more broadly. Often when people think about American regime change, they think about the United States just clicking its fingers and overthrowing a government somewhere. Anything less than that, Jack Devine argued, doesn't count. But critics of American foreign policy often say the same thing. They often argue that the United States have the ability to intricately plan and control actors all the way from Washington. The truth is, all coups in history require the consent of the institutions of the nation in which they're being carried out. A good example of this, besides the failure of the 1970 coup, is the failure of the Soviets from preventing the 1973 coup from happening. No matter how much money the Soviets gave to the military, they wouldn't do what they wanted because they simply didn't like them. The coup in Chile didn't just happen because Nixon wanted it to, but because actors on the ground in Chile wanted to end democracy. Now, that might seem obvious, but it's something that America's leaders have repeatedly failed to understand. During the Bay of Pigs incident, Nixon was not only angry, but legitimately confused that the CIA was unable to organize the overthrow of the Cuban government. A helpless giant is what the president would call his country a decade later, as it was unable to secure its objectives in Cambodia, no matter how many rice farmers it set on fire. This same confusion has cursed almost every president since, from Clinton to Trump. They simply can't understand that there are limits on the power of the most powerful country in the world. This same confusion has spread to America's enemies as well. Putin's belief in color revolutions, that every time a corrupt dictator is overthrown, even a pro-American corrupt dictator, the United States is behind it, has been used to justify his war in Ukraine. We often don't appreciate the limits on what superpowers can actually do. Coups are a lot harder than most people think. In the immortal words of John Bolton,
with all due respect, one doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and that's not what he did.
Ooh, you made it to the cool post-credit scene of the 1973 Chile video on the 1973 coup. It wasn't made in 1973. Yeah, hopefully you enjoyed watching this video. You've made it good 28 minutes, however long this ends up being in editing. You probably enjoyed this video, either that or you were just so enraged by how terrible it was that you skipped to the end. So in that case, fair enough, this probably won't win you over. But in the case that you did watch it to the end, hopefully you enjoyed that. I'm going to be doing more videos like that. I'm going to be doing more history videos, doing some on economics, some on politics, some on international relations. But yeah, if you like this video, I'm going to be doing more like it. One other thing, one cool little secret from the post-credit scene, all of the citations for all of the things said in this video are in the description below. I'd also like to do I lied, one more thing. Deep apology if you're a native Spanish speaker or if you've ever done Spanish ever, because you could probably tell how terrible my pronunciation was. A special apologies to someone, I've forgotten your name, hyphenated and Torres. I don't want to say it out loud again because I'm worried about getting it even worse. I think that was probably the worst pronunciation of the entire video. So a special apology to you. But yeah, sorries all around to everyone who has a Spanish name or can speak Spanish. Sorry, please forgive me. But yeah, thanks for watching.